You have 72 hours to drain that monstrosity or face legal action. Barbara Chen snarled, her clipboard clutched like a weapon as she stood at the edge of what had once been David Rodriguez's backyard. The pool stretched before them, impossibly vast for a residential lot. Its crystal-clear water reflecting the Florida sun like a mirror of defiance. David's hand shook as he held the violation notice, the HOA letterhead seeming to mock him with its pristine corporate font. Barbara, you know this isn't what it looks like. The permits were approved 18 months ago. The city inspector signed off on everything. The permits were for a standard residential pool. Not this. She gestured wildly at the expansive water feature that dominated 3 adjoining backyards. This commercial water park you've built without authorization. What Barbara didn't know, what none of them knew, was that David had quietly purchased the neighboring lots 6 months ago when the elderly Kowalski couple moved to assisted living and the Patel family relocated for work. The transactions had been handled through a shell company to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. He'd planned to reveal the truth at the annual HOA meeting next month, but that was before his 8-year-old daughter Sophia had been diagnosed with juvenile arthritis and her physical therapist recommended hydrotherapy sessions that cost $200 each. You can't just expand your property line because you feel like it, Barbara continued, her voice rising with the familiar pitch of someone drunk on small-town authority. This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that ruins property values for everyone. Behind her, 3 other board members nodded in synchronized disapproval. Margaret Winters, the treasurer who'd been fighting with David about landscaping fees for 2 years. Tom Morrison, whose own pool permit had been rejected last spring for aesthetic concerns. And Janet Hill, who'd never forgiven David for the time he'd reported her dog's excessive barking to animal control. David glanced toward his kitchen window, where Sophia watched from her wheelchair, her thin face pressed against the glass. The pool had been her sanctuary these past months. The warm water, the only thing that seemed to ease the constant ache in her joints. Yesterday, she'd managed to swim 3 full laps without stopping, her face bright with accomplishment. Today, she might lose it all because of a bureaucratic misunderstanding that had spiraled into something much more sinister. I can show you the property deeds, David said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. I own all 3 lots. The pool construction was legal. Convenient story, Barbara replied, checking something off on her clipboard. But your little shell company games don't change the fact that you violated HOA covenants. Section 4.3 clearly states that no recreational facilities may exceed 1,000 square feet without board approval. Section 4.3 was amended last year to allow larger pools for medical purposes, David countered. I have the documentation from before you were even on the board. How convenient that you pushed through an amendment that directly benefited your future plans. The accusation hit like a physical blow. David had joined the HOA board 18 months ago, not out of any desire for power, but because he'd seen how arbitrary decisions were ruining his neighbors' lives. The Kowalskis had been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden that was supposedly inconsistent with community aesthetics. The Johnsons had been forced to repaint their house 3 times because the color was deemed too vibrant. When David had proposed the medical exemption amendment, it was because Mrs. Patterson down the street needed a therapeutic hot tub for her chronic pain. You're suggesting I somehow planned my daughter's diagnosis? David's voice dropped to a whisper, the words heavy with disbelief. Barbara's expression didn't soften. I'm suggesting you took advantage of a convenient situation to build an unauthorized commercial facility. And now you're hiding behind your daughter's condition to avoid consequences? The cruelty of it stole David's breath. He'd spent his entire career as a civil engineer designing public spaces that brought communities together. When Sophia's diagnosis had turned their world upside down, he'd channeled that same philosophy into creating something beautiful and functional. The pool wasn't just oversized, it was carefully designed with varying depths, therapeutic jets, and accessible entry points. He'd even installed a small water slide and lazy river feature, imagining other families in the neighborhood whose children might benefit from the space. The community deserves better than your backyard water park, Tom Morrison added, his voice dripping with resentment. "Some of us follow the rules." David looked at Tom, remembering how the man had sulked for months after his own pool application was rejected. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tom's proposed pool had been rejected because it was too close to the property line, a violation David had quietly supported at the time because he believed rules mattered. Now those same rules were being weaponized against him, twisted into something unrecognizable. "I followed every rule," David said, his voice gaining strength. "I own the property. I have the permits. I amended the covenants legally. What I built serves a legitimate medical purpose." "What you built," Barbara said, stepping closer, "is a slap in the face to every family in this neighborhood who's trying to maintain property values and community standards. You can't just buy your way out of accountability." The words hung in the air like a challenge. David felt the familiar sting of assumptions about his success, the way people looked at his engineering firm and his carefully maintained property and assumed privilege rather than decades of hard work. His parents had cleaned office buildings. To pay for his education, he'd worked construction jobs through college, learning to build with his hands long before he learned to design with his mind. Every square foot of his success had been earned through sacrifice and determination, but explaining that history wouldn't change the reality of this moment. Barbara and her allies had already made their decision. The pool would have to go, and with it, Sophia's mobility and independence, unless David could find a way to expose the personal vendettas and procedural manipulations that had led to this confrontation. "The enforcement hearing is scheduled for Thursday," Barbara announced, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision. "You'll have 15 minutes to present your case before the full board votes on remedial action." "Remedial action," David repeated. "Forced compliance," Margaret clarified with evident satisfaction. "If you don't drain the pool voluntarily, we'll obtain a court order and have it filled with concrete at your expense." David's mind raced through possibilities. The hearing would be a kangaroo court, with Barbara's allies outnumbering any reasonable voices. The legal costs of fighting an actual court would be astronomical, and the process could take years. Meanwhile, Sophia's condition would continue to deteriorate without the therapeutic benefits of the pool. "I want to address the full community," David said suddenly, "not just the board, an open meeting where everyone can hear the facts." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "The covenants don't provide for Section 2.7, David interrupted. "Any homeowner facing punitive action has the right to address the community in an open forum. It's been on the books since the neighborhood was established." The four board members exchanged glances, to quietly drain the pool and accept defeat. The prospect of a public hearing where their motivations might be scrutinized was clearly unwelcome. "Fine," Barbara said finally. "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. But the rules still apply. 15 minutes to make your case, then the board votes. And David," she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, "don't mistake this for weakness. Some fights aren't worth winning." As the board members filed away, David remained by the pool's edge, watching the water lap gently against the custom-built steps he'd designed specifically for Sophia's wheelchair. The sound was peaceful, almost hypnotic, but underneath it, he could hear the ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to disaster. Inside the house, Sophia was still watching from the window. When their eyes met, she pressed her palm against the glass in a gesture that broke his heart. She was too young to understand the politics of the situation, but old enough to sense that something precious was being threatened. It had become a place where she could move without pain, where she could be just a kid again instead of a patient. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Looking for allies in a battle he was only beginning to understand. The next few days would determine whether justice could prevail over prejudice, whether community spirit could overcome personal vendettas, and whether one man's fight for his daughter's future could expose the corruption that had infected their neighborhood's leadership. The pool stretched before him. 30,000 gallons of crystal-clear water that represented everything he'd worked for and everything he stood to lose. But as he watched Sophia's reflection shimmer on the surface, David knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep people tried to bury it. David's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m., jolting him from the few hours of sleep he'd managed to grab. Sophia's therapy session had run late the night before, and he'd spent the remaining hours poring over HOA documents, looking for any angle that might save their pool. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Angela Santos from Channel 7 News. I heard about your situation with the HOA, and I'd like to discuss it with you." David rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. "I'm sorry, who gave you my number?" "Mrs. Patterson down the street. She's been fighting the HOA for months over her medical hot tub. She thinks your story needs to be heard." The mention of Mrs. Patterson sparked something in David's memory. Eleanor Patterson, 83 years old, had been battling the board for 6 months over her therapeutic spa. Despite having a doctor's prescription and David's medical exemption amendment, Barbara had found technicalities to delay approval. The elderly woman had been forced to drive 30 miles to a community center for her arthritis treatments. "What exactly did Mrs. Patterson tell you?" David asked, his engineer's mind already connecting dots. "She said, you're not the first person the board has targeted. According to her, there's been a pattern of selective enforcement, particularly against residents who've challenged board decisions or supported changes to the covenants." David felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of pattern? That's what I'd like to discuss. Can we meet this morning? I'm already in your neighborhood." An hour later, David found himself sitting across from Angela Santos in a corner booth at Rosie's Diner, the same restaurant where he'd celebrated Sophia's first successful swim lap just 2 weeks ago. Angela was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of investigating stories others preferred to ignore. "Let me start with what I know," Angela said, pulling out a tablet and swiping through files. "Barbara Chen has been HOA president for 4 years. In that time, enforcement actions have increased by 300%. But here's the interesting part: almost every family targeted for major violations has one thing in common." She turned the tablet toward David, showing a spreadsheet with names, dates, and violation types. David scanned the list, his heart sinking as he recognized pattern after pattern. "They all voted against board recommendations," David said quietly, "or supported changes that the board opposed," Angela confirmed. "Mrs. Patterson advocated for the medical exemption amendment you proposed. The Kowalskis voted against increased HOA fees. The Johnsons supported your motion to allow home-based businesses. Every single family on this list has been hit with escalating enforcement actions." David studied the data, his engineer's training helping him see the mathematical impossibility of it being coincidence. "This is systematic harassment. It gets worse," Angela continued. "I've been digging into Barbara Chen's background. Did you know she owns a property management company that specializes in HOA enforcement?" The revelation hit David like a physical blow. She's profiting from this. Her company, Pinnacle Property Services, has contracts with 16 HOAs in the county. They charge flat fees for routine management, but they get substantial bonuses for enforcement actions and legal recoveries. The more violations they find, the more money they make. David's mind reeled. That's a massive conflict of interest. She can't be HOA president and profit from enforcement actions. Legally, she can, as long as it's disclosed. But I can't find any record of disclosure in your HOA minutes or annual reports. Angela swiped to another screen, showing financial documents. Here's what's really interesting. Pinnacle Property Services has been recommending community improvements to several HOAs, things like mandatory landscaping upgrades, pool maintenance contracts, and security system installations, all provided by companies that give kickbacks to Pinnacle. "So she's running a racket," David said, the pieces falling into place. "Target families who oppose her agenda, force them into compliance or out of the neighborhood, and profit from the enforcement process, and use the fear of enforcement to push through profitable improvements that benefit her bottom line," Angela added. "I've found similar patterns in 3 other neighborhoods she manages." David thought about the last 2 years of HOA meetings, remembering how Barbara had pushed for expensive landscaping requirements, mandatory security systems, and pool maintenance contracts with specific vendors. At the time, he'd assumed she was just being thorough. Now he understood the real motivation. "What about the other board members?" David asked. "Are they complicit?" Margaret Winters is Barbara's business partner. In another venture, they own a landscaping company that's gotten several HOA contracts. Tom Morrison's construction company has done renovation work for families trying to avoid violations. Janet Hill's husband works for the security company that got the mandatory monitoring contract. The scope of the corruption was staggering. David had assumed he was dealing with petty neighborhood politics, but this was an organized scheme to exploit homeowners and extract profit from manufactured crises. "Why haven't you reported this already?" David asked. "Because I need proof of direct harm and a victim willing to go public," Angela replied. "The other families have been too intimidated to speak out. Some have already sold their homes and moved away. Others are afraid of retaliation. So, I'm your test case. You're different from the others. You're educated, financially stable, and you have a compelling personal story. Plus, you actually followed all the proper procedures. You own the property. You have the permits. You amended the covenants legally. If they can destroy you, they can destroy anyone." David looked out the diner window toward his house, where Sophia was probably doing her morning stretches by the pool. The water therapy had made such a difference in her mobility and mood. The thought of losing it to Barbara's greed was unconscionable. "What do you need from me?" David asked. "Access to your documents, permission to interview you on camera, and the courage to stand up at Thursday's hearing with the truth. I'll have a camera crew there to document everything. And if I refuse, then Barbara wins. Your pool gets filled with concrete, and this story dies with your daughter's treatment options." The choice wasn't really a choice at all. David had spent his career building things that served communities, creating spaces where people could thrive. He wouldn't let a corrupt board destroy that legacy, especially not when Sophia's future hung in the balance. "I'll do it," David said, "but I want to understand everything first. Show me all the evidence." Angela smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I was hoping you'd say that, because there's something else you need to know about Barbara Chen." She pulled up another document on her tablet, this one showing property records from 5 years ago. "Barbara used to live in Oakwood Estates, the neighborhood next to yours. She had a house with a pool, 2 teenage kids, and a husband who worked. In commercial real estate, they went through a messy divorce. She lost the house, the pool, and primary custody of the kids. The financial settlement left her struggling to maintain her lifestyle." David studied the records, seeing the timeline of Barbara's financial troubles coinciding with her aggressive expansion into HOA management. "So this is personal for her. Your pool represents everything she lost, and your successful challenge to her authority threatens the income stream she built to get back on her feet." The psychological dimension added another layer to the conflict. David understood now why Barbara's hostility had felt so personal, why she'd been so quick to dismiss his daughter's medical needs. She wasn't just protecting her business interests, she was reliving her own loss and displacement. "There's one more thing," Angela said, her expression growing serious. "I've been tracking Barbara's enforcement pattern, and it's escalating. The families who fought back have faced increasingly aggressive retaliation. Your pool hearing isn't just about compliance, it's about making an example." "What kind of example?" "The kind that keeps other homeowners from challenging her authority. If she can destroy a respected community member like you, with legitimate permits and legal ownership, then no one is safe." David absorbed this information, understanding that the stakes were much higher than he'd initially realized. This wasn't just about his family's pool, it was about the future of their entire community. Barbara's corruption was like a cancer, spreading through the neighborhood's governance structure and poisoning the relationships that held communities together. "I need to talk to the other families," David said. "If we're going to expose this, we need to do it together. I have contact information for everyone on the enforcement list. But David, you need to understand some of these people are scared. They've been beaten down by months or years of harassment. They might not be ready to fight back." "Then we'll help them get ready," David replied. "Because if we don't stop this now, it'll only get worse." As they left the diner, David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd stumbled into a battle much larger than his personal conflict with the HOA, but with Angela's research and the truth on his side, he finally had a chance to fight back effectively. The pool hearing was still 3 days away, but David knew the real battle had already begun. Barbara Chen had built her empire on fear and intimidation. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated a father's determination to protect his daughter's future. The Kowalski house felt hollow, its empty rooms echoing with the ghosts of a life interrupted. David stood in the former kitchen, looking out at the overgrown garden that had once been Eleanor and Stan's pride and joy. The elderly couple had moved to assisted living 6 months ago, but their neighbor, Maria Santos, still had a key and had agreed to meet David there. They were heartbroken when they left, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor cried for weeks after the HOA forced them to remove the vegetable garden, said it was 40 years of love they had to throw away. David walked to the window. Looking out at the patch of earth where tomatoes and peppers had once grown, the space had been replaced with regulation grass and approved shrubs, sterile and lifeless. It was a perfect metaphor for what Barbara's administration had done to the neighborhood, stripped away personality and community in favor of manufactured compliance. The fines started small, Maria continued. $25 for having stakes that were too tall, $50 for using the wrong type of mulch, but they kept escalating. By the end, Eleanor was getting $300 citations for things like inappropriate plant density and non-conforming garden borders. Did they ever fight back? Stan tried. He went to board meetings, brought documentation showing their garden was grandfathered in before the landscaping restrictions. But Barbara always found new violations, new reasons to find them. The stress made his heart condition worse. David felt a familiar anger building in his chest. The Kowalskis had been model citizens, the kind of neighbors who brought cookies to new families and organized block parties. Their persecution had been systematic and cruel, designed to force them out of the home they'd loved for decades. Would they be willing to speak publicly about what happened? David asked, but Maria looked uncertain. They're scared, David. Even in assisted living, they're afraid Barbara might find a way to hurt them. But I think if they knew other families were fighting back, they might be willing to help. David's phone buzzed with a text from Angela Santos. Patterson says yes. Johnson family wants to meet tonight. Morrison had second thoughts, too scared of retaliation. The coalition was slowly forming, but David could see the challenge ahead. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Barbara had wielded it effectively for years. Overcoming that fear would require more than just evidence. It would require hope. That evening, David found himself in the Johnson family's living room, surrounded by faces that bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged stress. James Johnson, a contractor, sat with his wife Linda and their 2 teenage daughters. The family had been fighting the HOA for 8 months over their home-based business. It started when I converted the garage into a workshop, James explained, his calloused hands clasped tightly together. I do custom furniture, mostly for neighbors and friends. Never had more than 1 or 2 customers at a time. But the HOA claims it's commercial activity, Linda added, her voice tight with frustration. They've fined us $6,000 and threatened to place a lien on our house. David studied the family, seeing the strain in their faces. The Johnsons weren't wealthy. James's workshop income supplemented his construction work, helping them manage their mortgage and save for their daughter's college tuition. The HOA fines were threatening to destroy their financial stability. Did you know about Barbara's property management company? David asked. James nodded grimly. Found out last month when I was doing some research. Her company recommended a business compliance consultant who would help me get proper permits for $1,200. When I refused, the fines doubled. It's extortion, Linda said bluntly. Pay her consultant or face escalating enforcement. Either way, she profits. Angela Santos had been right. The pattern was clear and consistent. Barbara had created a system where resistance was financially punished while compliance enriched her network of connected businesses. What changed your mind about fighting back? David asked. James glanced at his daughters, both of whom were listening intently. My oldest, Sarah, is applying to colleges next year. She wrote her admission essay about watching her family get bullied by corrupt officials and feeling powerless to stop it. I realized I was teaching my girls to surrender to injustice. We're not surrendering anymore, Sarah Johnson said, her voice carrying the kind of determination that David recognized from his own daughter. My dad builds beautiful things. He shouldn't have to hide that because some woman wants to make money off our fear. The conviction in the teenager's voice was infectious. David felt the coalition gaining strength, not just from shared grievances, but from shared values. These families weren't just fighting for their individual rights, they were fighting for the kind of community they wanted to pass on to their children. Mrs. Patterson is in, David announced, and Angela Santos has documentation of the financial conflicts. If we can get 3 more families to speak publicly, we'll have enough evidence to expose the entire scheme. What about the Hendersons? Linda asked. They've been fighting over their fence height for months. And the Nakamura, James added. Their kids play in the front yard too much. Apparently, Barbara's been citing them for excessive recreational use of front lawn areas. David made notes as they talked, building a comprehensive picture of Barbara's enforcement pattern. Every family had the same story. Minor violations escalated into major fines. Resistance met with increased pressure and offers of expensive compliance solutions from Barbara's network. We need to be strategic about this, David said. The hearing is in 2 days. We need witnesses who can speak effectively, documentation that's clear and compelling, and a way to present the information that the community will understand. About a visual presentation, Sarah Johnson suggested, like a timeline showing how the enforcement actions escalated after people voted against board recommendations. David smiled, recognizing the engineering mind at work. That's exactly what we need. Can you help create something like that? I'm good with computers, Sarah replied, and I'm really good at being angry about injustice. As the meeting broke up, David felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. The coalition was small but growing, and they had the truth on their side, but he also knew that Barbara wouldn't surrender easily. She'd built her empire on the assumption that intimidation would keep victims isolated and afraid. A coordinated resistance would threaten everything she'd worked to establish. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. David found a new violation notice taped to his front door. This one citing unauthorized media activity and disruption of community peace. The fine was $500, and the notice included a photograph of Angela Santos's news van parked in his driveway. Phone rang immediately. Did you see it? Angela's voice was tight with anger. She's escalating, David replied. This is retaliation for our investigation. It's also evidence. She's literally proving our point about selective enforcement and abuse of power. But David could see the psychological warfare at play. Barbara was demonstrating that resistance came with consequences, that speaking out would result in increased persecution. It was a calculated attempt to fracture the coalition before it could become effective. He thought about Sophia, who had watched from her window as he'd taken down the violation notice. She'd asked why people were being mean to their family, and David had struggled to explain adult corruption to a child who still believed in fairness and justice. We need to accelerate our timeline, David told Angela. If we wait much longer, she'll find ways to intimidate the other families into silence. I've been thinking the same thing. What if we hold a press conference before the hearing? Get the story out publicly so she can't control the narrative. David considered the idea, weighing the risks and benefits. A press conference would put maximum pressure on Barbara, but it would also escalate the conflict beyond any possibility of private resolution. Once the story became public, there would be no going back. Let's do it, David decided. But we need to make sure we have enough evidence to support every claim. If we're going to expose her publicly, we need to be bulletproof. I'll coordinate with the other families. We'll hold it tomorrow morning, right before the hearing. That gives us time to prepare and doesn't give Barbara time to organize countermeasures. As David hung up, he realized that the battle for his pool had evolved into something much larger. They weren't just fighting for individual property rights, they were fighting for the principle that communities should be governed by fairness rather than fear, by service rather than profit. The coalition was growing stronger, but so was the opposition. Barbara Chen had built her empire on the assumption that isolated homeowners couldn't fight back effectively. Tomorrow, she would discover what happened when fear gave way to courage, and when individual grievances merged into collective action. The pool in David's backyard continued to shimmer in the Florida sun, its clear water reflecting not just the sky, but the hopes and dreams of a community ready to reclaim its future. From corruption, the community center parking lot buzzed with nervous energy as David arrived at 9 a.m., 3 hours before the scheduled HOA hearing. Angela Santos had arranged for the press conference to be held in the same building where the evening's showdown would take place, a piece of symbolic theater that wasn't lost on anyone present. David counted 12 families gathered near the entrance. Some he recognized from the neighborhood, others were strangers who'd heard about the story through social media. Eleanor Patterson sat in her wheelchair, flanked by her daughter, who'd driven up from Tampa. The Johnsons stood together as a unit, Sarah holding a poster-sized chart showing Barbara's enforcement patterns. Even the Hendersons were there, despite their earlier reluctance to get involved. "This is bigger than I expected," David said to Angela, who was coordinating with 2 camera crews and a print reporter from the county paper. "The story went viral on neighborhood social media last night," Angela replied. "People are sharing their own HOA horror stories. Turns out, corruption isn't unique to your community." David scanned the crowd, noting the mix of ages and backgrounds. These weren't troublemakers or chronic complainers. They were ordinary families who'd been pushed too far by a system designed to exploit their desire for peaceful community living. "Are you ready for this?" Angela asked. "Once we go public, Barbara will pull out all the stops to discredit you." David thought about Sophia, who was spending the morning with her grandmother, swimming in the pool that might be gone by evening. "I'm ready." The press conference began with Angela providing background on the story, explaining how a routine HOA dispute had revealed a broader pattern of corruption and financial exploitation. She presented the evidence methodically: the undisclosed conflicts of interest, the selective enforcement patterns, the escalating fines designed to extract maximum profit from manufactured violations. "The data shows a clear pattern," Angela said, gesturing to Sarah Johnson's chart. "Families who vote against board recommendations face enforcement actions at a rate 5 times higher than those who comply passively. The average fine for board supporters is $67. For those who've challenged the board, it's over $400. David watched as reporters took notes and cameras captured the visual evidence. The story was compelling because it was mathematical, impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence or personality conflicts. When Angela introduced David, he felt the weight of representation. He wasn't just speaking for his family, but for every homeowner who'd been bullied into compliance by corrupt officials. "My daughter has juvenile arthritis," David began, his voice steady despite the emotional stakes. "The pool we built isn't just recreational, it's medical equipment that helps her maintain mobility and independence. I followed every rule obtained, every permit, and legally amended the covenants to ensure compliance." He pulled out the violation notice, holding it up for the cameras. "But because I dared to challenge the board's authority, because I proposed changes that put community needs ahead of board profits, my family has been targeted for systematic harassment." David could see the impact his words were having on the crowd. Several people nodded in recognition, seeing their own experiences reflected in his story. "This isn't about my pool," David continued. "It's about whether communities will be governed by fairness or fear, by service or profit. Barbara Chen has turned HOA enforcement into a personal profit center, and she's used that power to punish anyone who threatens her control." Eleanor Patterson wheeled forward, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 37 years. I've seen it grow from a small community where neighbors helped neighbors into something I barely recognize. When my husband and I needed a therapeutic hot tub for our arthritis, we were told it wasn't aesthetically appropriate. When we planted a garden to supplement our fixed income, we were fined for non-conforming landscaping. We weren't just losing our home, we were losing our dignity. The emotional power of Eleanor's testimony was undeniable. Here was a woman who'd contributed to the community for decades, driven out by the very organization that was supposed to protect her interests. James Johnson spoke next, his contractors, hands steady as he held photos of his custom furniture work. "I've built cabinets for half the families in this neighborhood. Beautiful, functional pieces that people treasure. But when I tried to formalize my workshop to help pay for my daughter's college, I was told it was commercial activity that violated community standards." The real violation was refusing to pay Barbara's consultant friend $1,200 for unnecessary permits. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone present. Barbara had created a system where legitimate community activities were criminalized, then offered expensive solutions through her network of connected businesses. It was a sophisticated protection racket dressed up as community governance. Sarah Johnson stepped forward with her chart, explaining the data analysis with the kind of clear, logical presentation that David recognized from his own engineering background. When you look at the numbers, the corruption is impossible to ignore. Every family that's voted against board recommendations has faced enforcement actions. Every family that's complied passively has been left alone. This isn't systematic retaliation. Angela fielded questions from reporters, providing documentation for every claim. The evidence was overwhelming, and David could see that the story was gaining momentum. But he also knew that Barbara would be watching, preparing her counterattack. As the press conference wound down, David noticed a familiar figure at the back of the crowd. Tom Morrison, the board member who'd been so vocal about David's unauthorized water park, was taking photos with his phone. David felt a chill of recognition. Barbara's intelligence network was already documenting who had spoken out. "She knows," David said quietly to Angela. "Good," Angela replied. "Let her know that the community is watching. Let her know that her victims aren't isolated and afraid anymore." But David understood that the real battle was just beginning. Barbara had built her empire on the assumption that homeowners would remain divided and intimidated. The press conference had shattered that assumption, creating a public record of her corruption that would be impossible to ignore. As families began to disperse, David felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Maria Santos, the Kowalski's neighbor, tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor called me this morning," Maria said. "She and Stan watched the press conference online. She wanted me to tell you that they're proud of you for fighting back. They said they wish they'd had the courage to do what you're doing." The weight of that message hit David hard. The Kowalskis had been forced from their home. Their 40 years of community contributions dismissed as violations by a corrupt board, but their story was now part of the public record. Their suffering transformed into evidence for positive change. "We're not done yet," David replied. "The hearing is this afternoon. That's where we make our final stand." As the crowd dispersed, David looked toward the community center where the evening's hearing would take place. The building represented everything he'd believed in when he'd first moved to the neighborhood, a place where citizens could come together to make collective decisions about their shared future. Tonight, that vision would be tested. Barbara Chen had weaponized community governance for personal profit, but she'd underestimated the power of truth and the courage of ordinary people. Pushed too far, the pool in David's backyard was still under threat, but it had become something more than a family necessity. It was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that communities belonged to the people who lived in them, not the officials who claimed to represent them. The press conference had been a success, but the real victory would come when the community reclaimed its power from those who'd abused it. David was ready for that fight, and he was no longer fighting alone. The community center's main hall buzzed with an energy David had never seen at an HOA meeting. Usually, these gatherings attracted maybe 20 residents, mostly retirees, with time to spare, and a handful of activists with specific grievances. Tonight, over 200 people filled the space. With more standing in the back and spilling into the hallway, Barbara Chen sat at the board table with her usual allies. But her confident demeanor from earlier in the week had been replaced by something harder to read. She kept glancing at the crowd, clearly unprepared for this level of community engagement. The morning's press conference had changed everything, transforming a routine enforcement hearing into a public referendum on her leadership. Before we begin, Barbara announced, her voice carrying over the crowd noise, "I want to remind everyone that this is a formal hearing with established procedures. We will not tolerate disruptions or inappropriate behavior." The warning fell flat. David could see the defiance in faces throughout the room, people who'd spent years being intimidated by that same authoritative tone were no longer impressed by it. Angela Santos sat in the front row with her camera crew, a visual reminder that this hearing was being documented for a wider audience. The local news van parked outside had already drawn curious neighbors, and social media posts were spreading. The story beyond the immediate community: we're here tonight to address violations of HOA covenants by resident David Rodriguez. Barbara continued, consulting her notes with theatrical precision. Mr. Rodriguez has constructed an unauthorized commercial facility in violation of Section 4.3 of our community covenants. David stood from his seat in the third row, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes. This was his moment to present the truth, to expose the corruption that had poisoned their community's governance. "I'd like to address the board and the community," David said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "You'll have your 15 minutes, Barbara replied curtly. "But first, we need to establish the facts of the violation." "The facts are exactly what I intend to discuss," David said, moving toward the front of the room. "Starting with the fact that I legally own all 3 properties where the pool is located." He pulled out the property deeds, holding them up for the crowd to see. "These documents show that I purchased the adjoining lots 6 months ago, making the pool construction entirely legal and within property boundaries." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many residents had assumed David was guilty of some kind of property line violation, but the evidence was clear and undeniable. "The permits were approved by the city," David continued, producing the official documents. "The construction was inspected and approved. The medical exemption amendment was legally passed by this board 18 months ago. Every aspect of this project followed established procedures." Barbara's expression tightened. The covenants clearly state that medical facilities are exempt from size restrictions," David interrupted. "I have the documentation right here, including the amendment that you voted for, Barbara." The crowd was listening intently now, following the legal arguments with the kind of attention usually reserved for courtroom dramas. David could see that the truth was having its intended effect. People were realizing that this wasn't about legitimate violations, but about abuse of power. "But this isn't really about permits or property lines," David said, his voice gaining strength. "This is about a systematic pattern of corruption that's been destroying our community for years." He gestured to Sarah Johnson, who stood up with her poster-sized chart. "The data shows that enforcement actions have increased by 3% under Barbara's leadership. But the increase isn't random, it's targeted specifically at families who voted against board recommendations." Sarah began explaining the statistical analysis, her young voice carrying the authority of mathematical proof. "Every family that supported community amendments has faced escalating enforcement. Every family that's challenged the board has been hit with fines, averaging $400. This isn't coincidence, it's systematic retaliation." David watched Barbara's face as the evidence was presented. She looked like someone watching a carefully constructed building collapse, brick by brick. "Furthermore," David continued, "we've discovered that Barbara profits directly from these enforcement actions through her undisclosed property management company, Pinnacle Property Services." The revelation sent a shock through the room. Many residents had been unaware of Barbara's business interests, and the conflict of interest was immediately apparent to everyone present. "That's a private business matter," Barbara said, her voice losing its earlier confidence. "It's a massive conflict of interest," David replied. "Your company gets paid bonuses for enforcement actions, and you've been recommending expensive compliance solutions provided by your business partners. You've turned HOA governance into a personal profit center. Eleanor Patterson wheeled forward, her presence commanding instant attention. I've lived in this neighborhood for 37 years, she said, her voice carrying the moral authority of experience. I've watched Barbara Chen systematically destroy the community spirit that took decades to build. My husband and I were forced from our home because we dared to plant a garden that fed our family and beautified our neighborhood. The emotional impact of Eleanor's testimony was immediate and powerful. She represented the neighborhood's history, its values, and its future. Her persecution had been not just cruel, but symbolic, an attack on everything the community had once represented. James Johnson stood next, his contractor's hands steady as he addressed the crowd. I've built custom furniture for half the families. In this room, beautiful, functional pieces that people treasure. But when I tried to formalize my workshop to help pay for my daughter's college, I was told it violated community standards. The real violation was refusing to pay Barbara's consultant friend $1,200 for unnecessary permits. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Barbara had created a protection racket, manufacturing violations and offering expensive solutions through her network of connected businesses. It was corruption disguised as community governance. The question before us tonight, David said, looking directly at Barbara, isn't whether my pool violates any legitimate rules. The question is whether this community will continue to tolerate corruption that turns neighbors into adversaries and transforms community governance into personal profit. Barbara stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. These are serious accusations that border on slander. Mr. Rodriguez is clearly desperate to avoid the consequences of his violations. Then let's vote, David replied. Let's have an open vote by the entire community, not just the board. Let everyone here decide whether the evidence supports enforcement action or exposes systematic corruption. The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. This was direct democracy in action, bypassing the corrupt board structure that had enabled Barbara's abuse of power. That's not how HOA governance works, Barbara said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's exactly how it should work, Eleanor Patterson replied. Communities belong to the people who live in them, not the officials who claim to represent them. Angela Santos stood up from her seat, her camera crew capturing everything. I've documented similar corruption in 3 other communities managed by Pinnacle Property Services. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a business model based on exploiting homeowners' desire for peaceful community living. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Barbara's corruption wasn't just local, it was systematic, spanning multiple communities and representing a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in HOA leadership. I call for a vote of no confidence in the current board, David announced. And I call for a community vote on whether my pool constitutes a legitimate violation or represents retaliation for challenging corrupt leadership. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the community center's walls like thunder. David could see the fear in Barbara's eyes as she realized that her empire was crumbling, that the intimidation tactics that had worked for years were powerless against organized resistance. This hearing is adjourned, Barbara announced, gathering her papers hastily. The hearing continues, Eleanor Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of moral leadership. We don't need board permission to govern our own community. Margaret Winters and Tom Morrison followed Barbara toward the exit, but Janet Hill remained seated, looking uncertain. The coalition that had enabled Barbara's corruption was fragmenting under the weight of public scrutiny. All in favor of declaring David Rodriguez's pool a legitimate medical facility that complies with all applicable covenants, Eleanor called out. The response was overwhelming. Easily, 2/3 of the crowd raised their hands in support. The community had spoken, and their verdict was clear. All in favor of a vote of no confidence in the current board leadership. Eleanor continued. Again, the response was decisive. Barbara's reign of corruption was over, ended not by legal technicalities, but by the simple power of truth and community, solidarity. As the crowd began to disperse, David felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Janet Hill, the board member who'd remained behind. "I need to apologize," Janet said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew what was happening, but I was afraid to speak up. I let my fear of retaliation prevent me from doing what was right." David looked at Janet, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. "It's not too late to make things right. I want to help," Janet said. "I want to help build the kind of community we all deserve." As David walked back to his car, he felt the weight of victory and responsibility. The pool in his backyard was safe, but more importantly, the community had reclaimed its power from those who'd abused it. The battle was won. But the work of rebuilding trust and establishing legitimate governance was just beginning. Angela Santos approached him as he reached his car. "This is going to be a big story," she said. "People need to know that corruption can be defeated when communities stand together." David nodded, thinking about Sophia waiting at home. She'd been swimming laps earlier, her face bright with the joy of movement without pain. Tomorrow, she'd still have that joy. But she'd also have something else: a father who'd shown her that justice was possible. When ordinary people found the courage to fight for what was right, the community center was emptying now. But the energy of collective action lingered in the air. Barbara Chen's corruption had been exposed and defeated, but the real victory was larger than any individual triumph. It was the victory of truth over deception, of community over exploitation, of courage over fear. 3 weeks after the hearing, David stood in his backyard watching Sophia guide her physical therapy instructor through the pool's adaptive features. The warm Florida morning felt different, now lighter somehow, as if the weight of conflict had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. "The jets in this section provide targeted resistance," Sophia explained with 8-year-old authority, demonstrating the therapeutic equipment David had carefully integrated into the pool design. "And the shallow end has textured surfaces for better grip during exercises." Dr. Martinez, Sophia's new therapist, nodded approvingly. "This is exactly the kind of facility we recommend for juvenile arthritis patients. The design is more sophisticated than most commercial therapy pools." David felt a surge of pride, not just in the pool's functionality, but in his daughter's resilience. Sophia had weathered the storm of community conflict with remarkable grace, somehow understanding that the adults around her were fighting for something important without fully grasping the political complexities involved. "Dad, can we invite the Patterson kids over this weekend?" Sophia asked, referring to Eleanor Patterson's great-grandchildren who were visiting from Tampa. "They've never seen a pool with a lazy river." "Of course," David replied, remembering his original vision for the space. The pool had been designed not just for Sophia's therapy, but as a community resource that could benefit multiple families. Barbara's enforcement action had threatened that vision, but the community's support had preserved it. Angela Santos arrived for their scheduled interview, her camera crew setting up near the pool's edge. The story of the HOA corruption had gained national attention, sparking discussions about governance reform in planned communities across the country. "How does it feel to be the face of HOA reform?" Angela asked as they began recording. Considered the question carefully. "It feels overwhelming and necessary at the same time. I never wanted to be a political figure, but sometimes circumstances don't give you a choice." "What's changed in the neighborhood since the hearing?" "Everything and nothing," David replied. "The pool is still here, Sophia is still getting better, and we're still the same family. But the fear is gone. People aren't afraid to speak up anymore, aren't afraid to challenge decisions that don't make sense." The changes were visible throughout. The neighborhood, the Hendersons, had installed their fence at the height they'd originally planned. James Johnson's workshop was operating openly, with a steady stream of customers admiring his custom furniture. Mrs. Patterson had finally received approval for her therapeutic hot tub, ending months of bureaucratic delays. "What about Barbara?" "Chen," Angela asked. David's expression grew serious. "She resigned from the board 2 days after the hearing. Pinnacle Property Services lost 6 HOA contracts when other communities learned about the corruption. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Barbara's scheme. Financial records showed that she'd extracted over $200,000 in enforcement fees and consultant kickbacks from the various communities she'd managed. The pattern of selective enforcement and manufactured violations had been systematic and deliberate. "Do you feel vindicated?" Angela asked. "I feel sad," David replied honestly. Barbara had the opportunity to serve her community, to help people solve problems and build something positive. Instead, she chose to exploit people's trust for personal gain. That's not just corruption, it's a betrayal of everything community leadership should represent. Janet Hill had been elected as the new board president, running on a platform of transparency and community service. Her first act had been to implement conflict of interest, disclosure requirements, and establish an independent appeals process. For enforcement actions, the new board is focused on serving the community rather than controlling it. Janet had explained to David during their first meeting, "We want to make decisions based on what's best for residents, not what's most profitable for board members." The transformation had been remarkable. Board meetings that had once been tense, adversarial affairs had become collaborative discussions. About genuine community issues, residents who'd been intimidated into silence were now actively participating in governance. Angela asked David thought about the families who'd contacted him after the story broke, sharing their own experiences with abusive HOA leadership. "Don't stay silent," he said. "Document everything, build coalitions, and remember that communities belong to the people who live in them. Corruption thrives in isolation, but it crumbles when people stand together." The interview concluded with footage of Sophia swimming laps, her movements fluid and confident. The pool had become a symbol of more than just medical necessity, represented the principle that communities should enhance residents' lives rather than restrict them. As Angela's crew packed up their equipment, David noticed Eleanor Patterson approaching in her wheelchair, accompanied by a young woman he didn't recognize. "David, I'd like you to meet my granddaughter, Rebecca," Eleanor said. "She's a lawyer specializing in HOA governance, and she's been following your story with great interest." Rebecca Patterson extended her hand with a firm grip. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable. I've been working on HOA reform legislation, and your case provides a perfect example of why we need stronger oversight and accountability measures." "What kind of legislation?" David asked. "Mandatory conflict of interest disclosure, independent audit requirements, and enhanced due process protections for residents facing enforcement actions," Rebecca explained. "The current system allows too much room for abuse, and your experience shows how quickly that abuse can escalate." David felt the weight of unintended consequences. His fight to save Sophia's pool had evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for systematic reform that could protect thousands of families from similar exploitation. "Would you be willing to testify at legislative hearings?" Rebecca asked. David looked at his house, where Sophia was visible through the kitchen window, doing her homework at the table where they'd once spread out violation notices and legal documents. The battle had taken its toll on their family, but it had also revealed their strength and resilience. "If it helps prevent other families from going through what we experienced, then yes," David replied. Eleanor Patterson smiled with satisfaction. As the Pattersons left, David returned to the pool where Sophia was practicing her freestyle stroke. The water was warm and clear, reflecting the afternoon sun like a mirror of possibilities. Sophia called out, completing a perfect flip turn at the pool's edge. "Dr. Martinez says I'm getting stronger every day." David watched his daughter's triumphant smile, remembering the fear and uncertainty of just a few weeks ago. The pool had been saved, but more importantly, the community had been transformed. Barbara's corruption had been exposed and defeated, replaced by leadership that actually served residents' interests. The lazy river feature gurgled softly, carrying floating toys in a gentle circuit around the pool's perimeter. David had designed it as a therapeutic tool, but it had become something more, a symbol of the community's renewed sense of flow and harmony. "Can we have a neighborhood pool party next weekend?" Sophia asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "I want to show everyone the new diving board you installed." David smiled, thinking about the original vision that had inspired the pool's construction. It had been designed as a community resource, a place where neighbors could gather and children could play safely. Barbara's enforcement action had threatened that vision, but the community's support had preserved and strengthened it. "I think that's a wonderful idea," David replied. "We'll invite everyone who helped us fight for this." As the sun began to set, David reflected on the journey from crisis to resolution. The pool in his backyard represented more than just a victory. Over corruption, it represented the power of truth, the strength of community, and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Sophia's laughter echoed across the water, a sound that had been threatened, but never silenced. The battle was over, but the community they'd built together was just beginning to realize its potential. 6 months later, David stood before a packed legislative hearing room in the state capitol, his testimony folders arranged neatly on the witness table. The Committee on Community Development had been studying HOA reform legislation for months, and David's case had become a cornerstone of their deliberations. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for traveling here today to share your experience." Committee Chair Senator Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in public service. "Your story has been instrumental in helping us understand the scope of governance abuse in planned communities." David looked out at the audience, recognizing faces from his neighborhood alongside representatives from HOA reform organizations. Across the state, Eleanor Patterson sat in the front row, her presence a reminder of the personal cost of corruption and the power of community solidarity. 6 months ago, I was a private citizen trying to provide medical care for my daughter," David began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The committee members listened intently as David recounted the story, the manufactured violations, the undisclosed conflicts of interest, the escalating enforcement actions designed to extract maximum profit from vulnerable families, but he also emphasized the solution: community engagement, transparent governance, and the power of truth to overcome institutional corruption. "The legislation you're considering wouldn't just prevent future Barbara Chens," David continued. "It would empower communities to govern themselves according to their values rather." Now serving as legal counsel for the HOA Reform Coalition, presented the technical aspects of the proposed legislation. Enhanced due process protections. Each provision addressed specific abuses that had been documented in communities across the state. Mr. Rodriguez's case is remarkable not because it's unique, but because it's representative, Rebecca testified, is inadequate to protect residents from exploitation. The committee's questions were thorough and probing. They wanted to understand how the corruption had developed, why it had persisted, and what systemic changes were needed to prevent similar abuses. What would you say to critics who argue that HOA governance is a private matter that shouldn't be subject to state regulation? When private governance affects thousands of families, when it determines whether children can receive medical care or elderly couples can remain in their homes, it stops being truly private. Communities deserve the same due process protections and transparency standards that we expect from public institutions. The hearing lasted 3 hours, with testimony from homeowners, legal experts, and even reformed HOA board members who'd witnessed corruption firsthand. The evidence was overwhelming. The current system was broken, and reform was both necessary and urgent. As the hearing concluded, David felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Tom Morrison, the former board member, who'd initially supported Barbara's enforcement action against the pool. "I owe you an apology," Tom said, his voice heavy with regret. "I was so focused on property values and rule enforcement that I lost sight of what communities are supposed to be about. You reminded us that neighbors should help neighbors, not exploit them." David studied Tom's face, seeing genuine remorse. It's not too late to make things right, to help build the kind of community we all deserve. The transformation in David's neighborhood had been remarkable. The new board, led by Janet Hill, had eliminated the manufactured violations and expensive compliance schemes that had plagued residents for years. Property values had actually increased as the community's reputation improved, and fear-based governance was replaced by collaborative decision-making. Mrs. Patterson is bringing her whole family, and the Johnsons are making barbecue. David smiled, thinking about the neighborhood gatherings that had become regular events. The pool had fulfilled its original purpose as a community resource, hosting birthday parties, therapeutic sessions. "Are you going to miss being famous?" Sophia asked with 8-year-old curiosity. I was never famous, David replied. I was just a dad trying to help his daughter. But he understood what Sophia meant. The media attention had been overwhelming. At times, with interview requests and speaking invitations from across the country, David had tried to balance his advocacy work with his family responsibilities. Privacy. Will the new laws really help other families? Sophia asked. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to make it safe for everyone else to do the same. The legislation had passed the committee with bipartisan support and was moving toward a full legislative vote. If enacted, it would establish the strongest HOA accountability standards in the nation, providing a model for other states grappling with similar issues as they pulled into their driveway. David noticed new construction beginning on the lot next door. The Hendersons had decided to build an addition with a home office, confident that the new board would evaluate their plans fairly rather than looking for reasons to impose fines. Dad, can we test the new pool lights tonight? Sophia asked, referring to the LED system David had installed 4 evening swim sessions. Of course, David replied, watching his daughter's excitement. Sophia's arthritis was well controlled now, her mobility and strength dramatically improved by consistent water therapy. The pool had given her back pieces of her childhood that disease had threatened to steal that evening. As colored lights transformed the pool into a magical aquatic landscape, David reflected on the journey from crisis to resolution. The battle had been difficult and sometimes scary. People to create extraordinary change. Angela Santos arrived for a final interview, documenting the long-term impact of the story she'd first reported 6 months earlier. Systems only work when people participate actively and hold leaders accountable. What's next for you? David looked at Sophia, who was teaching the Patterson kids how to use the pool's therapeutic features. I'm going back to being a dad and an engineer. But if other communities need help fighting corruption, I'll be there. The interview concluded with footage of the neighborhood pool party. Dozens of families gathered around the water that had become a symbol of community resilience. Children played in the shallow end, while adults discussed everything from school board elections to upcoming civic projects. Barbara Chen had tried to destroy this sense of community for personal profit, but her corruption had ultimately strengthened the bonds between neighbors. The crisis had forced people to choose between fear and courage, between isolation and solidarity. They'd chosen courage, and the results were evident in every conversation, every shared meal, every child's laughter. Echoing across the water. Dad, look, Sophia called out, executing a perfect dive from the new diving board. I can do anything. Community had been transformed, and meaningful reform was advancing through the legislative process. But the real victory was simpler and more profounder. Little girl with arthritis could swim whenever she wanted. In a community where neighbors looked out for each other and governance served the people rather than exploiting them, the pool lights shimmered on the water's surface, reflecting not just the artificial illumination, but the genuine warmth of a community that had rediscovered its values. The battle against corruption had been won, but the larger work of building and maintaining healthy communities would continue for home. David felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The pool in his backyard had become more than just a medical necessity, had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when ordinary people found the courage to fight for what was right. The water was clear and warm, perfect for tomorrow's therapy session and the next day's neighborhood gathering.